G'day, my name's David Denborough and it's a glorious day here in Adelaide, and I work at Dulwich Centre, and I'm really looking forward to talking with you this afternoon. In fact, I'm really giving this talk to invite you to be a part of a continuing project. My coffee cup seems to be quite large there. Anyway, I'm very much looking forward to talking to you because this is a topic that means a great deal to me, and it's also rather a challenging one. The topic is, can we in our work in some way contribute to social movement? Now, this is a topic that has been brought about through challenges and critique. There's a very long-standing critique of therapy, counselling, social work more generally, that so many approaches, as we respond to people who are experiencing significant suffering, our approaches may encourage personal solutions at the expense of bringing about or contributing to broader social changes. It's a profound challenge. It's profound in many ways, because if we are the receivers of stories of social suffering, which is a phrase that the Just Therapy team from Aotearoa, New Zealand, often speak about, and they speak about it with great respect, because receiving stories of social suffering is a profoundly honourable responsibility. And if we are the receivers of stories of social suffering, then how can we do so in ways that very much respect the personal experiences of those who are confiding in us, but how can we also ensure that we're not getting in the way of broader social change? Now, perhaps the book that was most challenging and at the same time inspiring to me on this topic is by Celia Kitzinger and Rachel Perkins. It's called Changing Our Minds, and I'll put this reference and a number of other references below this talk so you can follow them up if you like. Celia Kitzinger and Rachel Perkins are lesbian feminist writers, and that book, Changing Our Minds, is a very rigorous critique of how therapeutic philosophy and therapy in general has contributed to undermining the feminist movement. Now, I'm not saying if you read it you'll agree with everything within it. I'm just saying that I personally found it very challenging and very inspiring. And this project, therefore, about can we in some way contribute to social movement, is not coming from some grand or romantic place, and it's certainly not coming from a place of thinking that I or we are somehow on the side of right, going off as champions to create social change. It's instead coming from a critique, trying to think about, in what we're already doing, could we be getting in the way of broader social changes? Could we in any way be diminishing the chances for broader justice for the people with whom we're meeting? My family, my ancestors, have done profound harm in this land in which I'm sitting, and I'm a white Australian man. Would be something very wrong if I thought somehow that I could join a project in which I was going to be on the side of right, charging off and bringing about social movement or social change in some way. So this project really isn't about that. It's hopefully going to be a collective endeavour, looking in small ways, critically reflecting on our own practice about what we're doing and what we're not doing, and seeing if we can join together across differences and in partnerships to see if there might be some ways that our work and the use of narrative practices can contribute to social movement. Now, when I say social movement, I don't mean like a great big social movement. I'm using the term, like Bell Hooks used the term feminist movement, as a verb. And this is a topic we've been looking at for some time. I'll post at the bottom of this video a chapter from the book Collective Narrative Practice of the same name, Can We Contribute to Social Movement? And it includes like a checklist of a number of themes that I try to look at to reflect on my own work and the work of Dialectics Centre Foundation, to see if we are, may in some way inadvertently be lessening the chances of people joining to bring about social changes, let alone any ways that we might be able to contribute to them. So that's a little bit about the broader context, and I really genuinely am inviting anyone who's interested in this theme to get in touch. There'll be a forum underneath this video presentation, and Marcela Palenko has very kindly offered to respond to those who might like to write in Spanish. And down the track we hope to have many people from many different contexts grappling with these questions, because they're just questions at this stage, they're just dilemmas, and hopefully we might be able to come up with something together. So I want to first of all just look at a couple of different themes that we've already been exploring over the last 7 or so years, and these are taking the shape of questions and possibilities, and some of them are included in the book Collective Narrative Practice. So I'm just going to speak about them briefly today. The first realm that I'm really interested in is looking at actually what's already happening in the field of narrative practice and what's happened in the history of narrative practice, including with the concept of externalizing. That key breakthrough within narrative practice in the early 1980s, so 30 years ago, externalizing the problem. The person is not the problem is the problem, which of course was a response and a determination not to participate in pathologizing practice. Now, what I'm really interested in is that I think there's another part of that phrase that needs to be added. The person is not the problem is the problem, and the solution is not only personal. And actually, if we look at the history of narrative practice, there are many existing examples right throughout its history where externalizing the problem leads to the possibilities of broader, local, collective action. Not grand action, but local, meaningful action. And the best example, I think, is a very old story. It's back to some of the early externalizing work of Michael White, where he was working with Richard and Richard's mum. And this is written up, and I'll put the reference below. And Richard was having trouble sleeping at night and not wanting to go to school because of the fears. The fears were keeping him up at night. The fears was how this problem was externalized, and Michael invited Richard to draw these fears. And very early on, after Michael had seen quite how scary the fears were, he asked Richard, wow, are these fears keeping anyone else up at night? Are they disrupting anybody else's sleep, not just yours? What about the neighbours? Now, Richard hadn't never thought about this before. He hadn't thought that his private, personal issue with the fears might actually be one that was shared with others. So he didn't know the answer to that question, but he thought that he could ask the neighbours whether the fears were also keeping up anybody in the adjoining houses. What was also then significant is that after Richard then did manage to change his relationship with these fears, he came up with a whole method of educating the fears, in which he placed them in a box overnight. He let them out again in the morning because he thought it would be cruel to keep them in all the time. But he educated these fears overnight, these drawings of the fears that he had created, and over time he managed to get his life back from the fears. He managed to be able to sleep more easily, and he managed to go back to school. And I think because Michael had asked early on about whether this was a social problem, not just a personal problem, Richard then asked other children in the school whether any of them were being affected by the fears. He discovered that they were. He offered to educate their fears for them, that he could borrow their fears overnight, put them in the box, bring them back to them the next day. And Richard then became the first president of the Fear Busting and Monster Taming Association of Australia and New Zealand. This was in collaboration with David Epstein in New Zealand. Now, this is just an example of externalizing, being the person is not the problem is the problem, and the solution is not only personal. I'm very interested in that, looking for other examples and thinking about how externalizing practice can lead to these broader social actions. So that's the first theme I just wanted to mention. We can actually look back on the history of narrative practice and unearth these social forms of externalizing. The second theme that we've already been exploring is that when people come to meet with us, they are so often representing themselves, but they're also representing a social issue, a broader social issue. And if we start noticing this, if we start noticing in the ways that people speak, that they're not only speaking in the first person, but they're also using you or we, the second person or the third person, if we start following people's speech patterns, we can see that so often people represent not only their individual personal experience, but also link their lives to social issues. If we do that more and more in our work, not imposing an agenda, but listening for the collective agenda that people are actually introducing us to, then I think our work can move more and more towards honouring both personal experience and trying to enable people to join in some local way to address the social issues that are affecting their lives and the lives of others. And this takes me on to the third theme that we've already been looking at over the last 4 or 5 years, and that is that if we're meeting with one person or one family or one group who have been going through great hardship, how can we find a way to enable that person, family or group to make some contribution to another individual, family or group who are also enduring a related or a different hardship? We can reconfigure our work so that it involves enabling those who have developed hard-won knowledge about a particular issue can make a contribution to others who are also experiencing hardship. This notion of enabling contribution is a very exciting one to me. It's actually made the work that I'm involved in much easier, because it means that people can speak through me or through us to others. Many times I'm in contexts where why would people want to talk to me, white, middle-class Australian man? But perhaps they'd be interested in talking with others who've been through similar difficulties. Perhaps they'd be interested in making a contribution to others. And invariably this is the case, and invariably this can generate some sense of social movement. So these are the themes we've already been looking at, and I'm very interested in continuing those explorations, but I'm also interested now in inviting you and your communities and the people with whom you're working to join in looking at a number of different additional themes. There are 5 of them. So seems to be a lawnmower happening in the background there, so hopefully you'll still be able to hear these 5 themes. So nice being outside. Some of you might be watching this in winter. Glorious summer day here in Adelaide. Anyway, these 5 additional themes. The first one is sometimes we're approached by people who are involved in social movements or involved in human rights work, and they are requesting counselling or requesting some way to help them sustain themselves in their work. And we're going to launch a small project to really try and explore how can narrative practices be used, whether it's in individual conversations or in group conversations or in the development of resources that can sustain human rights workers or sustain activists. Because if someone's trying to work for a broader purpose and there are certain things in relation to their personal experience that are being quite debilitating or overwhelming, how can we respond using narrative practices in ways that will support the personal experience and support the broader purpose, the broader social movement or human rights work that the person is engaging with? That's a good challenge. We're going to be working with Po Lin Lee on that question, and any of you who are interested. I will post a link to a workshop that took place in collaboration with the International Women's Development Agency and a number of women's organisations of Burmese women that took place in Thailand, that was exploring how narrative practices could sustain human rights workers. So I'll post that below, and we'll be very interested in your thoughts or in other ways that narrative practices can be used to sustain activists or human rights workers. So that's the first additional theme that I'd like to invite you into. The second new theme relates to community organising. Community organising and narrative practice. In the last 15 years or so, various community organising writers and thinkers, including Marshall Gans, have become engaged with the narrative metaphor. It's in a bit of a different way than we're engaged with it, but it seems to open great potential for collaborations and conversations about how can narrative practices be used to assist communities to organise and to spark and sustain local action on the issues that matter the most to those communities. The one example within the field of narrative practice that already exists is inspiring work from Uganda by Caleb Wakungu. And I'll post a link to this also. This is a form of collective narrative practice or community organising to enable people to engage with their own histories in ways to spark and sustain action in relation to addressing poverty and sparking economic projects. It's fantastic work, and I'm wondering how that work of Caleb's and how the engagement with the narrative metaphor by community organisers could perhaps start a bit of a conversation, and we could see where it leads. So if any of you out there are engaged in community organising and interested in narrative practice, and I know of some key colleagues already who are doing this, then it'd be great to be in touch, see what can be dreamt up. Okay, that's the first two. The third theme or strand that I'm really interested in exploring together relates to protest. There's a particular local example that's going to happen here in South Australia, because our South Australian government seems to have decided that South Australia would be a wonderful place to have perhaps the leading world's nuclear waste dump. Such an extraordinary idea. So there will no doubt be considerable protests taking place in relation to that issue and others. And I grew up in the 1980s when my father and mother were dedicating much of their lives to trying to prevent nuclear madness, and certainly remember many experiences of being on protests and marches in those days. And I don't know whether this is possible, but I'm interested in exploring with others how protests might be shaped and sustained if they also involve considerations of resonance and rich story development, and ensuring that what's spoken and how things are spoken and sung and performed in particular protest gatherings might be more likely to resonate with those present and those watching. I'm also interested in how a particular protest might make a contribution to another protest in a different place, how there might be able to be exchanges, and how people who've had first-hand experience, or communities who have first-hand hard-won knowledge, might be prioritised in what's spoken at any protest. So these are just early considerations, but I'm hoping we might find ways to bring all that's known in relation to rich story development in community events, in community gatherings, and see if the protests that we may participate in or may organise for issues that are dear to our hearts may lead to resonances and connections, and that this might sustain the protests and sustain those involved in them. So that's the third theme. There are just two more to come, although you might think of extras. Hopefully you will think of extras and include those in the forum. That would be fantastic. The fourth theme is to be looking at how existing narrative methodologies can be used and are being used to mobilize action in different places. And I'll just mention two examples now. One relates to Spanish colleagues, Monica Florenza and Jordi Frisas. Please excuse my accents. They are engaged with others in Spain who are responding to people affected by mortgages and foreclosures, people who are at risk of losing their houses. And amongst many sorts of actions that they are doing, they are using the team of life methodology, which uses sporting metaphors to think of, if we are a team, who would our goalkeeper be, who would be our strikers, who would be our fans cheering us on. They are using this narrative methodology to celebrate victories, goals that have been achieved by this movement, and also to plan collective strategies. This has also been used in workshops in West Papua. So that's one example. The team of life narrative methodology might be able to be used to support particular social actions. And the other example is collective testimonies. And I'll put a link to a collective testimony from West Papuan survivors of the Biak massacre in West Papua. the ways that they have been using a collective narrative testimony to honour multiple stories about this injustice, and to spur themselves and witnesses to further action. So they're just a couple of examples, but I'd be very interested in us exploring a number of ways that narrative practices can be used to mobilise and support the actions of local people in addressing the hazards or hardships that they are facing. The last theme that I'll mention in this presentation is slightly more theoretical, but it's also profoundly personal, and that is when people in our field, narrative therapy and community work, when we talk about identity, we focus on all sorts of influences on identity. We've become much broader than thinking about identity as just individual or and somehow located within. We've certainly challenged all of that, but I very rarely, if ever, hear discussions about how our identities are shaped and have been shaped by social movements. My life, how I understand my life, how I understand my identity, my body, my hopes, my dreams, how I understand any of this has been profoundly influenced by social movements, by the women's liberation and feminist movement, by the queer movement, by the nuclear disarmament movement, by the Aboriginal land rights movement. All these movements have completely changed how I understand my life. If those movements didn't exist, there is no way I would be the same person. I think they've been just as influential as any other influence in my life. And yet I don't think we talk about this. Well, I'd love to talk about this. We're developing some exercises where we can explore this. And what would it mean if we started considering our identities a little more broadly, so that they included both how we're influenced by social movements, and therefore how we can also influence our and other people's participation in these broader social trends and actions. So they're the 5 invitations that I would love to make to you and love to hear from you about. I just want to come back to the theme of critique, though, where I started. If you have any critique of anything that I have been saying in this presentation, or if you have any critique of my work or the work of collective narrative practice in relation to how it may be inadvertently diminishing possibilities for social change, or any other critique for that matter, I'd be very open to hearing about that. Or if you have critical reflection about your own practice, about how you may be missing opportunities for linking people together who are having similar experiences of hardship. This project isn't just about running off into the future with these new grand plans. It's always, I hope, going to be equally reflecting on what we're already doing and how it may not be enough, or how it may be having inadvertent consequences. So I really invite that continual critique of anything that I've said now and as we move forward, hopefully together, on this project. So I'll put my email address down below as well. I'll look forward to hearing from you. I might not respond straight away, but I will respond. I say I might not respond straight away because this is a long-term project. This project relates to harms that my ancestors have done on this land, profound harms, and I'll be involved in this project for my lifetime. Hopefully it won't take me a lifetime to get back to your email, but just to say there's no it's a long-term project. I think I've probably managed to convey that, and I hope also to convey that I appreciate you watching all the way to the end, and I appreciate your interest in this question of can we contribute to social movement, and I look forward very much to hearing from you. Thanks a lot.